An article at theparanormalguide.com entitled Mandy the Haunted Doll. And the author begins. Mandy the doll was donated to the Quinalan District Museum, British Columbia, in 1991. Almost immediately, she gave the impression of being quite a creepy doll, leaving people feeling uneasy, especially when unexplained activity began to take place around her. The creator of the Quinalan District Museum, British Columbia, Canada, was sitting at her desk when an antique doll was plunked down in front of her. Being donated to the museum was a 90-plus-year-old doll. The donor stating that it was getting old, was fragile, and she did not want her young daughter playing with it and further damaging it. The doll, named Mandy, had belonged to the woman's grandmother. But rather than being sad to be parted with what should have been a treasured possession, the woman seemed anxious to be rid of it. The curator took hold of the doll and immediately felt uneasy. She chalked up this feeling to the fact that the doll had an incredibly creepy look to it. Its clothing was old and faded. The soft, stuffed parts of its body were ripped in places. But most creepy of all was the doll's face. It was realistically painted and had glass eyes. But the forehead over the doll's right eye was cracked, causing the eye to protrude slightly, like it was intently peering at onlookers. Mandy was taken to the museum's workroom to undergo some maintenance before it could be placed on display. The doll was enclosed in a plastic bag to test whether bugs had infested it. Any bugs or insects leaving the doll would be caught by the bag, thus letting the museum staff know of infestation. However, this realistic-looking scarred doll being placed in a plastic bag added to the uneasiness the museum staff felt when they looked at it. Those working in the same room as the doll swore they heard the bag rustle, as if the doll had moved inside. And it was not insects causing the movement either. The doll would change positions. After the initial analysis of the doll was complete, it was time to photograph it, a process all artifacts at the museum undergo for the record book. The next morning, when staff re-entered the lab, they found it had been messed up overnight. Smaller objects had been thrown about the room and across the floor. Larger, heavier objects were just pushed over on the spot. This would happen any time Mandy was left in a room by herself overnight. The curator likened the mess to what would happen if a child had thrown a tantrum in the room. When Mandy was finally placed on display within the museum itself, it was one of the first things the visitors would see as they passed the entryway. They would mostly feel uneasy when looking at the doll. There seemed to be something incredibly wrong with it. At times, photographs taken of the doll would not turn out. They would all be blurred images or have strange light anomalies present in them. It got to the point that the uneasiness felt by visitors had staff placing Mandy further back in the museum in her own glass display case. Eventually, a psychic inquired as to whether they could hold the doll to see what they could pick up. Upon this reading, the psychic felt that it had suffered much abuse, the doll, that is. But it was not the doll who was suffering, but rather the spirit that inhabited it. What developed from this is an origin story to the spirit inhabited. What developed from this is an origin story to the spirit inhabiting the doll. This cannot be proved, It may just be legend or folklore, but it is believed that the doll was found in the cellar of an old farmhouse. Origins. A man was walking past the farmhouse when he thought he heard some crying coming from within. The odd part about this child's cry was that the passerby knew the farmhouse to have been empty, abandoned, so no child should have been present. He walked up the drive and knocked on the door. No answer. The crying continued, so he had to look around. He entered the empty farmhouse and discovered the crying came from below his feet. Not knowing how to access the building's cellar from the inside, he went back outside to find the external entrance. As he learned from the... Lost my place. As he opened the storm doors, light illuminated the room, and he made a shocking discovery. The body of a young girl, long dead, lay on the floor, with a doll held in her arms. It is not known why the girl was in the cellar in the first place, whether it was by accident or as some sort of punishment. Regardless, it is believed that when she died, her spirit decided to inhabit the doll. A horrible story, and no doubt a story that may not be believed. However, there is a link between some aspects of the doll's origin and the woman who donated it to the museum. When strange events surrounding the doll had started to take place at the museum, the curator decided to visit the doll's previous owner. It was here that she learnt the truth. The owner had not donated the doll for fear of her daughter breaking it. If that was the sole reason, then she would have just placed the doll in a box and out of reach. No, the real reason was that when the doll was in her house, the woman could hear a crying coming from the cellar. And when she would investigate it to find the source of the sound, she would find nobody there. The cellar's window would be open and the doll on the floor. When this began to happen more frequently, she decided to get rid of it and donated it to the Quinnell Museum. From the very first night that the doll was no longer in her house, the unexplained crying had stopped coming from the cellar. It's a good way to cure the crying. Here at HorrorSociety.com is a story by Michael DiFilippo entitled Forget Annabelle, Meet Mandy the Haunted Doll. Here you get to see a little bit better picture of her cracked face. And Mr. DiFilippo begins. In a world where the paranormal exists, meet Mandy the Haunted Doll, who is currently on display in the Quinnell Museum in Canada. Mandy, a doll created sometime between 1900 and 1920, was given to the museum by a donor who wished to remain anonymous. The donor had a chilling experience with the doll and wished to get rid of it without destroying whatever historic quality it possessed. One night, the donor was awoken by extremely loud cries, the cries of a baby, that echoed and radiated from the basement, where the doll had been left. Only one problem: a baby was not present in the house at this time of night. After hours of listening to the shrieks, the donor finally mustered up the courage to sneak into the basement and examine the source of the cries. Upon arrival, they found nothing but an open window and the fact that Mandy was missing, only to return the next morning. After dropping Mandy the Haunted Doll off at the museum, the donor confirmed that an experience like that never occurred again. However, the arrival of Mandy at the Quinnell and District Museum started a new wave of distress and discomfort for the staff and visitors there. Almost immediately after being placed in front of the front door, Staff members started reporting that their lunches were going missing, only to show up neatly tucked in random drawers hours later. Books and stationery started going missing on a routine basis as well. Eventually, Mandy had to be moved to a more private display, one away from other dolls of her kind, because it is rumored that she would topple them over in the middle of the night, just due to some sort of jealousy. Mandy the Haunted Doll was heavily featured in a 1999 issue of Supernatural Stories around British Columbia. And that's when people started flocking to the museum to see the haunted doll for themselves. People who visited the decades-old toy had trouble getting pictures of Mandy because their batteries would die. The flash of their cameras would inexplicably turn off. The flash of their cameras. The flash of their camera would inexplicably turn off while they were trying to take a photo. Psychic investigators who have visited Mandy state that the doll is most likely possessed by the spirit of a young little girl who only wants attention from people around her. That's why the doll is only mischievous and never violent towards humans.